Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Financial Inclusion Forum event on Universal Basic Income. I'm Rod Dubitsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Inclusion Forum UK. Before I hand off to the panel, let me say a little bit about the Financial Inclusion Forum. And I believe we have some slides, Lauren, if you can just... the Financial Inclusion Forum exists to raise awareness of financial inclusion and to share best practices. We do this by holding in-person and online events for experts and the general public. We also share best practice via social media, website, and our blog. It's great to be partnering with Financial Inclusion Week again, and we are ready. We are grateful to them for hosting us and promoting ours and other works in this vital area. I'm extremely excited for this event. This has been a long time in planning. I'm very happy to have an esteemed panel with us. Thanks to all our speakers today, and in particular, Financial Inclusion Forum board member Christine Hutton, who was instrumental in putting this all together. We're 100% volunteer board, and our events are free, so couldn't be here with the support of our corporate and individual sponsors. And Lauren, if you can jump to the next slide. I'd like to thank our sponsors, EY, Citi, CDC, and Vision Fund. So before I hand off, let me just, if you can go to the next slide. Feel free to, if you'd like to support us, either by partnering with us, sponsoring with us, or by donation, here's a few links, our email address, and how you can support us and join our mailing list. You can just Google Financial Inclusion Forum UK, and you'll find our website with all this information on it. And final slide, I believe there's one more, is just a snapshot of our coming events. And with that, I'm going to hand off to our moderator, Will Hutton. And I'm sure Will needs no introduction, but for the record, among many of his roles, Will is an accomplished author, president of the Academy of Social Scientists, a columnist, and previous editor of The Observer and co-chair of the Purposeful Company. And with that, off to you, Will.
Well, thank you. We've got precisely 58 minutes on my kind of clock, and everyone I think who's on this call knows what it's about. 30 seconds on that, and we'll cut to the chase. I mean, universal basic income is seen as is increasingly advocated as a mechanism for citizen entitlement for basic material need. And actually, our panel is going to examine that proposition. And all of them have direct experience of this, both in the developed world and actually in the less developed world. And not only kind of why this is a moral imperative, but also some of the technical questions about actually how it's physically done. You know, what's the role of, cash transfers, FinTech? How do you and how do you how do you deploy it to actually proactively find pathways kind of out of poverty? So I think what we're going to do briefly, the panel is on the screen. Professor Guy Standing, who's a colleague of mine on the Progressive Economic Forum, has pre-recorded his presentation, and he is unable to join us live, and apologizes for that, of course. But it's a pretty good presentation. So with no more ado, I'm going to start with kind of Isabel Wisson from BRAC. Then we'll go to Guy, then Zara, then Malcolm. You can please place questions in the chat. I'll pick them up, or my colleagues who will pick it up, who are behind the scenes here, and we'll have a conversation after the four presentations. So if we kick off, Isabel, you are the Special Assistant for Strategy at BRAC. You founded in Bangladesh. You now kind of universalizing yourself kind of across the less developed world. Over to you. You have the floor. Off you go.
Thank you, Will, and thank you to Financial Inclusion Forum UK for having me. It's a real privilege to be here. So just reflecting on the title of this panel, graduation programs are sometimes considered an alternative safety net, but really I would look at it as a way of building onto safety nets and in a way that complements cash transfers. And just to speak a little bit more on Bangladesh and our experience there, and actually I'd take down the slide just for a moment, and I'll let you know, Lauren, when to pull it up. But yeah, so BRAC is a large INGO founded in Bangladesh in the early 70s. Now, working across a range of countries, as Will mentioned, implementing a large range of development programs, and because BRAC has always had a holistic philosophy to its development and poverty reduction programs. Now, BRAC has also administered cash transfer programs as a single intervention, and this was absolutely critical during the COVID-19 pandemic and the first lockdowns in Bangladesh. I suppose we come to this discussion on UBI versus cash transfers versus graduation from a very particular line of inquiry or objective that BRAC was in pursuit of, which was, how do you ensure you reach people in the very worst forms of poverty, people who are the most vulnerable, the most excluded in a given environment, and figure out what are the interventions necessary to bring people in this level of vulnerability to a point of being able to enjoy one's agency, live a dignified life. In other words, spring the poverty trap. And in terms of what that end goal looks like, it's having a stable income, it's having a fulfilling livelihood, good health, children in school, savings, but also social acceptance and social inclusion. And so the graduation approach was BRAC's answer to that. And you may hear these invariably referred to as cash plus programs. The World Bank refers to them as economic inclusion programs, which are a little more broadly defined. But we're talking about similar programs that are multi-layered and get people to a point of stability and resilience and dignity. And I'm going to cut to the chase, but just to paint a picture of who these reach, for BRAC, we're often talking about single, often abandoned women with very menial livelihoods, who are chronically undernourished, considered a burden within their communities, have a lack of social ties, limited education, vocational skills, and who may not be included in village meetings, gatherings, events, and really so people who are both economically and socially excluded. And so in terms of the interventions to address this, and Lauren, if you could pull up the slide now, that would be great. We find it easiest to think about the graduation approach in terms of 4 pillars. And the first pillar is around meeting basic needs, and this is often met through a cash transfer. Sometimes it's a stipend, depending on the resources that are available. But we regularly, will layer onto a government cash transfer program, and this is intended to, meet people's basic needs, put food on the table, create that sense of security and stability that reduces the risk of taking time from a menial livelihood or a low productive activity in order to build skills and work towards something that is more fulfilling and more lucrative. And that takes me to the next pillar around income generation. And so these represent interventions offered to enable a household to enter into a more productive and lucrative income. And this always includes a large transfer, usually in the form of cash as well, which is intended for a household to procure a productive asset or access a particular vocation. And so in this pillar, we also complement that with it could be entrepreneurship training, it could be particular vocational training. Then we come to financial inclusion, which involves financial literacy training, access to savings accounts or savings groups, which we see as being really crucial to financial management, planning for the future, and increasing resilience to shocks. And then really importantly, there's a piece around social empowerment. And so particularly with this population, participants benefit from opportunities to share and learn with other community members, to participate in larger community meetings. And some of these mechanisms are really important for building a sense of self-confidence, self-belief, and a sense of feeling positive about the future. And so, and Lauren, you can take down the slide. Thank you. And so the point being, when it comes to extreme poverty and the work that we're doing in the developing world, we're looking at populations with intersecting vulnerabilities that demand an integrated approach that address overlapping causes of deprivation. People aren't just lacking in the economic capital, but and so economic focused interventions would only take them so far. And we've seen that reflected in the evidence too. There's a lot of evidence behind that approach. I don't want to use up too much of my time. But to conclude, I mean, we wouldn't look at it as a matter of cash transfers or universal basic income versus graduation programs. I think the experience with graduation has demonstrated that there's a really clear value in ensuring basic income security, because this provides the foundation for building on these other layers that taken together are critical for breaking the poverty trap and entering people into a heightened sense of well-being, and this is especially important for extreme poor populations that face multiple intersecting vulnerabilities. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Isabel, just before we move on to Guy's presentation, have you an example of this graduation approach? I mean, it's a very, essentially, the four pillars intersecting. I mean, it's, it's impressive, looks impressive. As an example of it working in practice?
Absolutely, yeah. So BRAC has been implementing this program since 2002 in Bangladesh. I think to date we've reached 9.2 million households. But it's, if you look at economic inclusion programs, they're reaching something like 92 million people. So this is an approach that is being really proliferated across the world by NGOs and governments alike, because I think there's recognition that single source interventions don't quite go far enough a lot of the time to end to end situations of really entrenched poverty.
Where is just before we move on? Where is the resource coming from? How much of it is from aid programs? How much is raised by NGOs? How much is it from a particular country's own tax base?
Yeah, so we're seeing. I mean, so from BRAC, a lot of the work that we did was funded by what was formerly known as DFID, but we're seeing an increasing for the government programs. We're seeing an increasing number of programs be funded directly by governments. There's a lot of funding that comes from multilateral donors as well. So it's a real mix, but we're starting to see a shift towards more of that funding coming directly from tax bases.
And lastly, is it focused mainly on marginalized women, or is it universal?
It's mostly focused on women. I'm not sure what if you look at economic inclusion programs, which is a bit broader, I think you see more programs that include men. But most graduation programs and NGO implemented programs focus on women, but the interventions are also intended to benefit the whole household, with the women being the entry point.
I'm sure there'll be questions for you in the chat, but thank you. Now, the next presentation is from Guy Standing, professor. He's well, he's a professorial research associate at SOAS, economist, fellow of the British Academy of Social Sciences. Great, one of our fellows, and a passionate advocate of basic income, along with a critique, actually, of the way contemporary capitalism has kind of manifested itself increasingly around rentier structures, rent-seeking, whether it be digital platforms, monopolists, in all their guises. So I have to say, actually, I don't agree with him on everything, but it's a pretty it's a robust position, and he has had some success, I think, in advancing the cause and actually kind of rendering it practical. So, with no more ado, over to Guy.
I'm speaking to you from the country where the largest basic income pilot is underway, and I'm about to go to Barcelona from Kenya, where a second pilot is underway, which is following a very successful first pilot. And there are actually dozens of basic income pilots in various parts of the world taking place at this moment, or are completed. And a common set of findings have been produced across the world in different types of country. And the most important is that a basic income, even at very modest level, paid to each individual, paid without conditions, paid regularly each month, as an anchor of a social protection system, as an anchor of an income distribution system, results in improvements in mental health, in physical health, in social attitudes, in the status of women, and increases in work, not decreases, common prejudiced criticism. And I think that the evidence from these various studies and both theoretical and empirical work of other types is pretty strong, that it has strong positive effects. But that's not the justification for a basic income that I want to urge you to consider. The reason for supporting a basic income is ethical, not instrumental. If properly designed, it would reduce poverty, it would reduce inequality, and so on. Instrumentally, it would have a very good effect on the economy. It would work much better as an automatic stabilizer than the quantitative easing that's been used recently. But all of those things are instrumental. The ethical justification is threefold. First, it's a matter of common justice. The income and wealth of all of us is far more due to the efforts and achievements of the many generations before us than anything we do ourselves. And if we allow for the private inheritance of private wealth by an elite, which is a lot of something for nothing, if I may say so, then we should see a basic income as a sort of common dividend, because we don't know whose ancestors contributed more or less to our collective income levels. And a common dividend is a matter of common justice. If you're religious, I'm not, but if you're religious, then you could say that God has given us unequal talents, and a basic income would be a way of compensating those who don't have talents to make money or be brilliant or so on. And I think that's why Pope Francis has come out in support of the basic income. The other matters of justice I've developed in my book, but there are many arguments for saying that this should be a right, not a charity. And the means-tested social security system that has developed in Britain and elsewhere is fundamentally a judgmental system. It's a matter of charity, pity or contempt, punishment or reward. It's a very authoritarian system in prospect. The second justification is that a basic income, even if paid at a very modest level, would enhance three types of freedom. It would enhance libertarian freedom, freedom to choose, the freedom to make decisions, the freedom to say no to exploitative or oppressive relationships, and the freedom to say yes to forms of work and labor that otherwise would not pay enough to be able to be taken. And that first form of justice, first form of freedom, is why Milton Friedman and others on the right came to support it. For me, that's not the most important type of freedom, but it's something we should accept. The second type of freedom that it would enhance is what's called liberal freedom. The freedom to be moral. I can only be moral if I have the capacity to make decisions on what to do and what not to do. Not because some bureaucrat tells me, but because I can actually make a moral decision myself. And the third type of freedom is known as Republican freedom, and that is the freedom to make decisions because I decide to make those decisions, not because somebody allows me to take a decision. That's why it's so important for women, and it's why all the pilots have shown that women benefit more than men. And the third ethical justification is that a basic income would enhance basic security. Basic security is a human need. We all need to have a sense of basic security. But also the psychologists have taught us that basic security results in an improvement in mental health, of improvement in capacity to make decisions. And what we found in the course of this pandemic is that basic security is fundamental to giving us a sense of resilience. And the resilience of all of us depends on the resilience of the most vulnerable in society. Today, we are faced with chronic uncertainty, not the sort of beverage-type situations of contingency risks. And in that context, we need to provide a sense of ex-ante basic security. I know that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, I will be able to feel just enough secure as to be in control of my senses. There are many other justifications, but these three ethical reasons are why I believe we need a basic income as a moral imperative as well as an economic imperative today. Thank you very much.
Great. I'd love to put some questions to Guy, but he makes his case pretty effectively. And it'd be good to have him. We might address that in the Q&A session, because I'm sure Malcolm and Isabel and Zara can kind of address this issue of moral hazard, which is but let's not go there. Let's next go to Zara, who's a social protection specialist. But in particular, what's striking about your experience is that you, and you must put me right if I got this wrong, I mean, you get to work, what provokes your intervention is actually a crisis. And it's very striking, in MENA region over COVID, British Virgin Islands, I mean, in the aftermath of the hurricane, I mean, I'm intrigued to learn how you find this kind of perspective so useful in your humanitarian work. So over to you with no more ado.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Isabel and Guy in absentia. Really, really interesting interventions, and thank you for the Financial Inclusion Forum for having me here as a speaker. It is quite interesting. I am somebody who ends up working in disasters, so it could be conflict, and Syria crisis is one of the most, one of the biggest that that has been ongoing for the last 10 years. Or then natural disasters like hurricanes, etc. The way that I have prepared to be able to talk about this is just to talk through, what are some of the key issues. I was asked to speak very much about alternative safety nets and to look at social protection in emergencies, let's call it. So I'll go through some of the key issues, key challenges, what I have seen working in the past, and keeping an eye to the future and what we're looking at with that. I also have a timer on. I've gone through 1 minute already, so let's see how much I can fit into this. First, we heard Guy also talk about a social protection system and how cash transfers or universal basic income can be such a tenet, or a guaranteed minimum income, let's call it that, without getting too fancy around the terms right now. And, the moral imperative, but, the mental health of people and how much that it can help with that. There are times when you do not have a social protection system that, that the government is unable to provide. This is when you can have the humanitarian system step in. So this is one of the massive areas in which I work. Yemen is a brilliant example of that. You have the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, that currently is gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is the wrong word, but is caretaking the social welfare fund, which is a government-run program, but the government is unable to run it right now. So UNICEF is administrating it on behalf of the government. So they are keeping a social safety net alive in that way. So that's one example. Lebanon is another brilliant example, and I'm full of Middle East examples because that's where I was just working with UNICEF, in fact. Where there is no social protection system at all, not one that is functioning or working. And with the Syrian refugee influx, you have a huge, massive population that does not normally come under a social safety net because it tends to be for citizens. So, what happens in that case? And you have the European Humanitarian Office and the EU, so both the development and the humanitarian side, who are looking at figuring out how do we do this funding. You have massive, massive multi-purpose cash assistance programs, which are basically an alternative safety net. The amount is not enough. We all know that, but it is covering huge swaths of the refugee population to be able to give them a monthly regular transfer, exactly how Guy was also talking about. Some of the key issues that we are looking at is, obviously, how do you fund this? And I hope Malcolm is going to talk a little bit around, how are we funding? How are we looking at these things? Otherwise, we can talk about it later. The political will. This is massive and this is huge. And this includes both, when you look at it on the development side for citizens, but also, on the refugee side or the marginalized side, or those people who are not registered within a formal system, is there going to be the political will to find the funding or to do programs like this? The other massive key issues that we have is around, who are you going to target and how are you going to target them? Can we look at efficiency in how this is being done? The identification part as well is huge. Who has IDs, who is registered within either a government system or with humanitarian agencies? And we are much more worried about, which we should not be, is inclusion errors rather than exclusion errors. And this, I would say, is one of those sorts of key issues and key challenges. In terms of what works is we should always, and this is something that the humanitarian side is only just getting used to doing, is look to strengthen the system as much as possible. If you have a strong social protection system, if there is an emergency, then you can use your existing system to get money out to people. You can use an existing social safety net to get money out to people. And that becomes incredibly important. There's also something to be said around inclusion of refugees. And how are we going to do this and what can we do? We have seen this work in some different places to a certain extent, I would say, where there are provisions being made to include refugees within its very, pilot stage, etc. But until we cannot figure that bit out, it's going to be a real problem. In terms of, we have a good example coming out of Egypt, actually, with the COVID response and how the government, they have a lot of informal workers, and how the government was actually able to take lists from different places. They knew their tourism industry, because of COVID, was really going to suffer. So, they went to different cooperatives or whatever, different sorts of places like that, to be able to get lists of people, to be able to include them within the system in order to be able to get the payouts that they needed. And, by the evidence that is being generated is that, this had a lot of benefits across the board. a key challenge that I do want to mention, even though I come from the humanitarian side, I work very much now on the social protection side, and we do have to, as humanitarians, cash is big business. These are also businesses, UN agencies, and yeah. In case they are watching, I think we should be able to say this out openly. It is big business. When donors give you money for cash, you get your overheads, etc. out of it. I'm very vocal about this, where I'm just like, can we cut out the middle person and be able to somehow either give to the governments, because that's where you will find the efficiency to get it out to a large population, or, how can we be more efficient around this? And somehow or the other, humanitarians need to get better about working with governments where they exist, strengthening their systems so that, we're not taking this big percentage, this big cut in a resource poor environment. Also, it's the correct thing to do. Governments have signed up to different conventions. They have their own, citizens' rights that they need to be able to meet. So we, as humanitarian and development workers, need to be able to support governments to be able to do that. So in the future, humanitarians need to be able to give up ownership around this and this very colonial mindset that we have, like, we're going to go in and help people. It's like, let's look at localization and being able to work with it that way. I think the normalizing of the idea even of, a basic income is coming a long way. It's really, really going to help, and we keep doing that. And with that, I guess I'll just say, for me, this revolution will be localized, and we really, with a global lens, but we really need to be looking down that path. I'll stop there.
Let's take the Lebanon. I mean, I'm there's so little time, but just give a sense of how a universal basic income is either better than what was done before or more efficient than what was done before, and actually how people react to it when it wasn't there before the humanitarian crisis.
So Lebanon, it's a complex political emergency. I'm actually headed there next week for 2 weeks to be able to look at this issue in a lot more details. I mean, if there were, right now there is a very, very, very fragmented social protection system that does exist. It is mostly supported by outside funding as well, which is not a problem, but it does not include refugees. So you have two parallel systems that are also happening right now. Also, so much of their current social protection system is based on subsidies and energy subsidies and fuel subsidies, food subsidies, etc. This is not efficient. So one of the things, and I'm pretty sure this is open knowledge, so it is okay to share it on this forum, is that the European Union, along with UNICEF, with the supporting UNICEF and the International Labour Organization, they will be looking at a 2-year project to support the government of Lebanon for citizens, for Lebanese, to be able to look at, how can they roll out child grants, which is one of the best ways in which you can start looking at universality. They're also going to look at pensions, which is, your social insurance part of your social protection programming. And they'll be looking at disability grants, etc. So it's a lot around inclusion of really marginalized populations and look at how you can have these systems. And also part of what Isabel was talking about before with cash plus programming is because it's not just about cash. It's very much about services that go with that as well. Just so that you know, and my project, or what I'm going to be supporting the EU delegation with doing over the next 2 weeks, is looking at are there lessons and stuff that we can be learning from the very parallel programming that is happening with cash transfers and services. Is there an alignment that we can make? Are there any recommendations we can make where these two streams can come together? And it's a caseload that perhaps the Lebanese government at some point can take on. Because at the end of the day, that is what you want. As per the Refugee Convention, et cetera, that we have, is that a government can also take on that caseload.
Okay, got it. Okay. Next to Malcolm. Malcolm Torrey, he's been involved in the basic income debate for most of my kind of adult life, actually. Director of the Citizens Basic Income Trust, visiting fellow at the LSE, and now he's general manager of the Basic Income Earth Network, and actually at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, where he's kind of developing his ideas. And actually, you're also practicing priest, Malcolm, at the Church of England. Good on you. You have the microphone.
Thank you. I wonder if the slides could be put up that I gave you. Thank you very much. I thank you very much for the previous presentations. I think that they show just how much thought is going into financial inclusion around the world. And there are many ways of creating financial inclusion, and an important one for the future, I believe, is basic income. What I'm not going to do is repeat Guy Standing's excellent presentation of the ethical arguments for basic income. Neither am I going to repeat his discussion of the instrumental economic arguments for it, which I think are extremely strong. What I'm going to talk about briefly is feasibility, because he didn't touch on that, and I think we must. He might have said a bit more about the pilot projects in which he has been heavily involved, and that he had a considerable hand in ensuring happened in the first place. And one of those was in Namibia, where a large community was given a small basic income for 2 years, and it showed considerable benefits to that community in terms of financial inclusion, educational success, health indicators, nutrition, and so on. And in India, a much bigger project supported by UNICEF showed all of those results, and in particular, substantial additional empowerment for women. And we saw in both of those projects a considerable increase in own account economic activity amongst low earners. And there was a significant result of that project. And what's important about what we know about the Namibian scheme is that if it was rolled out nationwide, it would cost 3% of GDP. This is an affordable basic income that could be provided for the entire population without strain on the national budget. The Indian project was designed to use similar amounts of money. You may know in India, there's a vast array of different projects supporting people who are in poverty. And the basic income that was provided would be designed to replace much of that in a far more efficient way, and would be a much better way of providing financial inclusion for all of those communities. So that's simply to give some feasibility, the feasibility aspect of the projects that Guy himself has been involved in. Most of the research on detailed feasibility questions has been done in developed countries, particularly in the UK. And so I'd like to offer you just one example of the feasibility study in the UK. First of all, let's be clear about definitions. And I think definitions really do matter in this field. A basic income is an unconditional income for every individual. You will find the term basic income used in other ways, particularly in the United States and Canada. The definition that the Basic Income Earth Network and Citizens Basic Income Trust in the UK and a lot of other organisations around the world, and the Freiburg Basic Income Institute that recently been founded, and the consensus is this is what basic income means. Income paid individually, not affected by income, wealth, household status, employment status, or anything else. It can vary in relation to someone's age, but that is all. A vital distinction to make is between basic income, which is always an unconditional income, and a basic income scheme. It's a basic income with the specified levels for each age group, with the funding mechanism specified, and with such other details as frequency of payment also described. And in particular, any changes you might make to the existing tax and benefit system. And so, for instance, in India, you would have to say, what are we going to change in the other mechanisms designed to support poorer households. And in the UK, it's important to state in extreme detail what changes would be made to the existing tax and benefit system if we had a basic income, because that would determine the overall effects of the basic income scheme. Here is just one example of a feasible basic income scheme for the UK. And the first part of any such research project has to say, what do we mean by feasible in this particular context? And I'm offering this as an example because in every context, we would have to ask, what are the criteria for feasibility? And here are the feasibility criteria that we tend to use in basic income research in this country, particularly at the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex, where I do this research work using UK MOD, their microsimulation program. And so, first of all, we have to say there will be as few changes as possible to the current tax and benefit system, consistent with the other aims in view. Revenue neutrality, we just have to stick with that in the short term, though we would like to be able to fund a larger basic income from other sources of income. And the avoidance of significant household net disposable income losses, absolutely vital as a feasibility criterion, because it's very easy in a complex basic benefits and tax system to make a change that tips low-income households into more poverty. We must avoid that. We want to see inequality reduced, poverty reduced, and a cap on additional income tax, because that's important psychologically as well as financially. So here's the scheme that comes out of those criteria. I don't invent schemes and then test them. I look at the criteria, look at the large number of possible basic income schemes using a microsimulation program to find out what their effects would be, and keep working at it till I find a scheme that fits those criteria. Because if a scheme is not going to be feasible, then we need to stop talking about it. And the only way to prove that a basic income is feasible in any country is to show that there is at least one basic income scheme that will be feasible in that country. And this goes for any country. If there is not a feasible scheme for India, Namibia, the UK, anywhere, then we need to stop talking about basic income for that particular country. So here is the detail of the scheme for the UK. We're basically looking at a funding mechanism that removes most of the income tax personal allowance and makes various other changes. And here is the basic income that emerges from that research. It gives a basic income of £60 per week to each working age adult. Now remember, the means tested benefit system is left in place, and an awful lot of households will get taken off it by their basic incomes. But it's the only way, by leaving it in place, we manage to prevent net income losses for low-income households. So there's the details of the scheme. I won't go through all of them, but you can see the general picture. And we aim at revenue neutrality. That is the net cost of the basic income scheme will be within £2 billion of zero per annum. Here are the gains and losses, and we have to make sure that low-income households don't suffer significant losses. That's as low as we can get them, those bottom two figures there. We have such a complicated system in the UK that getting those losses down below that is almost impossible. Here are the changes in means tested benefit, costs of the benefits overall, and the number of people on them. There are significant changes there. I got into this debate because I once administered means tested benefits and wanted to get people off them because they are so awful. And that's important. Here are the changes in poverty rates, which would be generated by what is a relatively minor basic income scheme. As you can see, the figures on the right there show considerable increases, decreases in the poverty of every single group on the left. That's before housing costs, that's after housing costs, significant reductions in poverty for a very simple scheme. And here are the redistribution patterns, and this is what I call a virtuous redistribution pattern. Considerably increases the incomes of lower income households, and it will cost more for higher income households because we are removing income tax personal allowances and charging additional national insurance contributions and so on. But that's a viable, it's a doable redistribution pattern. The important thing about basic income is that it would not necessarily provide extra money for households, but it will provide a secure layer for households. And as you can see in that bottom line there will be substantial secure layers of income. And remember, this is a revenue neutral scheme. This would not cost additional government revenue from anywhere outside the tax and benefits system. There's the research. If you're interested, there's a new feasibility study on basic income in Wales, just being published on the University of Bath website. And the one at the top is the one I've just shown you with all the detail attached to it. Thank you. I'd be very happy to answer questions.
Malcolm, I mean, immediate question from me. I mean, I think it's a very nice differentiation between universal basic income and a UBI scheme. And what I didn't understand from your presentation, and I'm sure it's me rather than the presentation, is just how that example you put up, kind of how that works with current systems. I mean, how does it work? I mean,
yes, I'm sorry. I was trying to get it into 7 minutes. It usually takes me rather longer to explain.
Yeah, you did well. Yeah.
I think I managed just not much over more than 7 minutes. We would leave the existing system entirely in place. The virtue of a basic income scheme designed in this way is that it doesn't have to make any changes to the structure of the existing tax and benefit system. It might change the tax rate slightly. It will reduce substantially an income tax personal allowance because you're now paying a basic income to all of those people. But we don't need to change the structure, and we leave means tested benefits exactly as they are. This is how the British social policy tradition works. Other countries it's different, but in the UK, and this is what I'm saying, you have to look at the context. And in order to create financial inclusion in a country like the UK, you have to say, how are policy changes made in this context? And we've always in the UK made changes by adaptation, evolution, adding rather than subtracting. And so we would leave everything as exactly as it is, and the basic incomes would automatically take people off the means tested system at quite a high rate.
So means testing would remain at a higher threshold.
A lot of people, because they were now receiving their basic incomes, would find that they were no longer receiving means tested benefits.
Right. So I mean, so the universal credit taper would kick in, but so you'd have a system where you'd have universal credit, your universal basic income, and then if you work whatever income you could achieve from working with this important cap on income tax. You want to just speak to that?
The answer is yes. You've described it precisely. Yeah, I
think it's a very important point because I mean the critics of universal basic income kind of always talk about the extravagant cost of it and disincentives to work and all of that. But you're actually saying that actually a component of someone who meets the threshold should just be an entitlement to an income as a matter of right for the very good reasons that Guy
absolutely
laid out. Yeah.
The critics of universal basic income usually have in their sights a large-scale utopian basic income which would discourage employment, discourage self-employment. It would cost vast sums of money and so on. Such a basic income scheme will be totally infeasible. We ought not to do it. What we can do is a scheme of this nature that will be entirely feasible. It would encourage rather than discourage employment and the formation of new businesses, because anybody who had been on means-tested benefits now was not on them because of their basic incomes would receive far more of each additional pound they earned than they received before. So there will be a greater encouragement for all of those people to seek new employment, to increase their wages, to learn new skills, and so on. And it's precisely in the UK context, the process that we saw happening in India and Namibia. These are very different contexts, but you will see similar processes going on in relation to the relatively small basic income.
Very good. Okay, well, let's get some questions in here. I'm just Zara, I mean, you already said you were going to be very brief, but this is from William Durban. How can humanitarians and social protection agencies partner with the private sector? Can that be an effective model?
Thank you for that question, William. It's always, I love how we always think of the private sector as a silver bullet. I encourage everybody to read the book, Winners Take All, from Anand Girahadas. It's a brilliant book where it talks about, it's not always just, we're not always just looking for a market solution. I do think we do have examples of humanitarian and social protection actors, and I will speak specifically around the cash transfer side of things, partnering with the private sector. There's obviously stuff around fundraising and actual funds, which I find much less interesting than the technical assistance and resources, such as like data management. This is one of our biggest issues on both sides of the equation, and it actually leads into one of the questions that Sadia was also asking around social registries, and governments will never abandon these, and what are we going to do around that? And this is where I think we can get private sector involved. So, how do we make interoperable data systems within governments to be able to handle the data? How do we get those who are not registered? I'm not a huge fan of biometrics, but in some cases, we can be looking at that. How can we get good data systems up and running? And I do think that the private sector has a lot to offer in that regard. I have a question for Malcolm, but I will wait because it's a difficult, thorny question after his presentation.
We'll get
yeah,
Malcolm, I think there's a couple of questions here in the chat for you, but we'll go to Sarah. We're not going to allow you to not answer your question, and I think you've kind of answered already, Malcolm. But I mean, Sam Mendelsohn asks if graduation programs, plainly work in low-income countries. And there's lots of proof positives of them that they work, but I mean, that's not a basic income for rich countries. So are the kinds of things that Isabel and Zara were talking about relevant in a kind of OECD context?
Well, there's a sense in which we have that in the UK, and it's called a universal credit. I've looked at BRAC's work in the past in a number of occasions, and been to BRAC conferences and so on. I think it's a brilliant piece of work, always has been from its beginning. And it's all a matter of context, I think, in the kinds of context in which BRAC is working. That kind of approach can be extremely helpful, not only to the individuals who have their economic lives transformed by it, but to the communities that they belong to. A very different mechanism is a basic income. Now, these have different effects, and they're entirely complementary, in my view. There's no competition between these. And there's not necessarily any competition between a means testing approach in an OECD country and a basic income approach. They would live perfectly happily together. I'm sometimes told by people that we'd rather have this than that. I don't think it's like that. So, for instance, a substantial national minimum wage is enormously helpful to low-income households. A basic income would be enormously helpful to low-income households. These are not in competition with each other. I've never understood this competition argument about them.
Look, we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to give Sarah a chance to ask her question to you, Malcolm, and I want Isabel to chip in because we're going to need the last word for you, Isabel. So, Sarah, what is your tough question?
Yeah, so Malcolm, that presentation was awesome. Really enjoyed it. It's very much a technocratic solution, and we need those. We absolutely need those. But here's what keeps me up at night as an American, as somebody who works on these systems with governments. You talked about how in the UK it's more of an addition, adaptation, etc. That's how it's been an iterative process. What are you going to do about the systemic violence and racism that is within these systems, and how are we going to actually address that? Not an easy one. I told you it was a difficult question, but it has to be. We have to think about this.
90 seconds.
I frequently hear the statement, "You haven't solved this, whatever this is."
Yeah.
You haven't solved the housing crisis with the basic income. You haven't solved disability costs with the basic. No, of course you haven't. Nothing can do everything. What I would say, and I perfectly understand what you're saying about the current system in the UK, and it's not just the UK. The United States has got an even worse example in many ways. What I would say about it is, no, I can't change all of that. Neither would a basic income change all of that. However, a basic income would itself have very different effects from the current system. And to insert a basic income into the current system would make the current system as a whole less violent, less stigmatizing, less demeaning. It would be less prejudiced against certain kinds of household structures and so on. It would be an incremental change to the ethos of the system. We've already got a little of that in our child benefit in the UK, which is unconditional still, in spite of attempts to make it not so. It has an enormous effect on households. This relatively small secure income coming every single month into their bank accounts, and it's a massive help simply because it's secure. And a layer of basic income within the current system would have exactly the same effect, and more so.
There's an argument, Zara, that the left everywhere. I can think of members of Democrats in the House. Kind of this is a kind of plays out, doesn't it, all the time, and this is the dialogue. Look, there's not time for you to come back because I want to give Isabel a chance to speak. Isabel, you've been sitting very patiently.
Thanks, Will. I think I'll just comment on Sam's point. I mean, we have seen similar approaches to graduation work for homeless communities in Scandinavia and other parts of Europe, and so I think graduation does not need to only live in the realm of the developing world. And equally, I would also really agree with what Malcolm was saying around how a basic income, even a modest one, can really free one up to be able to seek other opportunities and seek forms of employment and livelihood that people find more fulfilling. That is that is what we see in the countries where we implement, and likely we would observe that in wealthier countries too.
Well, look, we've got a minute left, and I just I want to thank all of you. I've certainly I found this graduation approach. I found the way it could be applied in Lebanon. I thought that your advocacy of basic income systems, Malcolm, was really moved me along. So for me personally, it's been a very illuminating 60 minutes. Guy's kind of passionate ethical case for this kind of meshes with the trio of you speaking so practically. It's been a very illuminating kind of 60 minutes. Great thanks to the Financial Inclusion Forum for laying it on. And I'm guessing, I can carry on, riffing for Britain. But I think that we've actually arrived at the hard stop. So thank you all. And let's kind of go back to the main body of the forum, or whatever the next item is. Thank you all very much. We can say goodbye.